Now, the key to applying your purposes, it's not enough just to define and communicate, but the key to application is, write this in, balance. Balance. You got to balance. God is not only a God of systems, God is a God of balance. Did you know that the earth is perfectly balanced? So that if it just turned 1 degree this way on its axis, it would burn up. And if it just turned 1 degree the other way, we'd freeze up. We are perfectly balanced to sustain life on this planet. When God made you, He gave you 2 legs for balance. He gave you 2 hands and arms for balance. He gave you 2 ears for balance. He gave you 2 eyes. He even gave you 2 nostrils. God is a God of balance. And the principle of balancing all 5 purposes is what we said yesterday, keeps you from the body getting diseased or diseased. Now, unless, I want to warn you, write this down, unless you set up an intentional process and plan, unless you set up an intentional process and plan to balance all 5 purposes, your church will tend to overemphasize the one purpose that the pastor is most passionate about. And I have seen this happen all around the world. You have to have a system. You have to have a structure. You have to have a process and a plan that gives equal balance to worship, fellowship, discipleship, ministry, and evangelism. Knowing Christ, loving Christ, growing in Christ, serving Christ, sharing Christ. You have to balance those, and if you don't have a system that keeps them in balance, you're going to overemphasize the one you love the most. And every one of us try to go to one the most. For instance, if the pastor has the gifts of evangelism, then you will tend to build what I would call a soul-winning church, which reaches a lot of people for Christ, but there's no discipleship going on. There's no depth, no maturity taking place on that. On the other hand, if you have teaching gifts as a pastor, then you will tend to build what I call a classroom church, where you're focusing on content and doctrine and knowledge and theology, and people are growing bigger and bigger, but nobody's getting saved. Or there's no ministry in the community. And you're going deep, but you're also not growing in the other areas. I think the most common church, you can see in that first column in there, I have Soul Winning Church, we have the Experiencing God Church. That's the church that, man, they've got great worship. And God comes down, and the presence of God is felt in the worship services. Maybe there's even signs and wonders. And God's there, but maybe there's no ministry in the community, and no social action going on, maybe no discipleship taking place. I call that Experiencing God Church. Most churches are this fourth area, I call it the family reunion church. And that is, the pastor has gifts in shepherding, and so you build a very good relational church, and everybody loves everybody else. But did you know fellowship overemphasized? Koinonia becomes koinonitis. And you can be so tight, nobody can get in. And you may have visited some of those churches where everybody had the same ethnic background or the same last name, or they all came from the same country, and nobody else could join unless you were part of the in crowd. And they're out of balance because they're overemphasizing fellowship. The family, we love everybody who's here, but we don't love all the people who are on the outside. And then there's the social conscious church. And these sometimes are liberal churches, and they're doing all kinds of cool things in the community. They're caring for the poor and the sick and the lame and the marginalized, and they are strong on justice, and they're strong on fighting bigotry and racism, and these are good things. These are good things. And your church needs to do these. But if that's all you do, and there's no discipleship, and there's no evangelism, or the worship is weak, then you get out of balance. And so you can see there the pastor's role in each of those kind of churches, what the people's role is. But what I want to teach you is how to build a church that does all 5 of those. The purpose-driven church balances all 5 of witnessing and worshiping and the committed in the crowd, the congregation, the committed, the core of knowing and feeling. And all of these things are done together. And the purpose-driven philosophy ensures balance because you have a strategy. and you've got a structure that will maintain your balance. So the question then becomes, how do you do that? How do you balance the 5 purposes of God in your church so it stays healthy so that it can keep growing? Because once it gets unhealthy, it's going to stop growing. Let me ask you this. Is everybody in your church at the same level of commitment? Of course not. Of course not. You have some people who are super committed. They're there every time the lights are on. They serve, they share, they give, they sacrifice, they pray, they lead, and they're highly committed. Do you have, at the same time, some people who barely show up every week? Yes. And between those two groups, which we call the community and the commissioned, you have a lot of varying degrees or levels of maturity. Now, these circles that I'm going to explain to you, you already have them in your church. They're already there. You already have people in every one of these levels. You just have never thought about identifying them as such, dividing them as such according to their commitment. Now, you don't tell people who they are. They tell you who they are by their level of commitment and what they're involved in. Now, up at the top where it says target and purpose, above the word target, above the word purpose, write down what we do. Write the phrase, what we do. The purposes are what we do. And then above the word target, I want you to write the phrase, who we do it with. And so there are 5 purposes, and you have actually 5 targets. Actually, there are 6 because evangelism has both a bring them in and send them out function. So evangelism on the front end and the back end, in the community and the commissioned. Now notice here that the purpose of evangelism, we do that in the community. And the purpose of worship, we do that in the crowd. The purpose of fellowship, we do that in the congregation. And we do that through small groups. The discipleship we do in the committed. Ministry is done by the core of our church. And those who go out on mission are commissioned, or they're sent out. So the whole idea is to move people from the outer circle, no commitment at all, that's the community, all the way through crowd, congregation, moving in to the commission, which is the most committed, and then you turn the commissioned around and send them back out. So the commitment level in your church ranges from very little, that's out there in the occasional attender level in the community, to the very mature level, such as those who are ministering in the core or going on mission in the commissioned. And the goal here is to move them through these circles. Now, what you're looking at that is an index for the rest of this conference, because we're going to spend a session on each of these circles and how you do the purpose and who you do it with. Evangelism in the community, worship in the crowd, fellowship in the congregation, discipleship in the committed, ministry in the core, and sending out the commissioned. Moving people from come and see to come and die. So, Jesus started where people are, but he didn't leave them there. He didn't leave them there. He started them where they were, but he took them to new places. Now, here's the problem. In a lot of churches, they're either come and see church or they're come and die, and you got to do it all. There's some churches that the whole purpose of church is just build a crowd. Let's get them in, get them in, get them in, get them in. I've actually heard well-known pastors say, it's all about the weekend. Get them in. It's all about the weekend. I could not disagree more. The weekend is simply a funnel. What are you going to do with them? A crowd is not a church. But a crowd can be turned into a church if you have circles of commitment and a process to move them on to maturity, ministry, and mission. And so there are some churches out there, they're growing really fast, and they're getting really big. But it's just attendance. I'm going to go, where's your small groups? Where's your people involved in ministry? Where are your people going out on missions? Where are the people fulfilling what God has told us to do? And then on the other hand, there's people over here, they're the hardcore discipleship people. We're the come and die, and we don't care if we get smaller because we're going to be a holy, purified, sanctified, frozen chosen. And they think they're really deep, and they think they're really mature, but you're not mature unless you're reproducing. And so nobody's coming to Christ, but they got their little holy huddle, and they hunker in a bunker, and they teach their theology, but no changed lives. You've got to do it all. That's the main thing I'm saying. You got to do it all. And you got to do it by having a process. What does it mean to be a purpose-driven church? Let me show you 10 ways that you can actually take the purposes and build them into your congregation. Now, let me explain this again. We don't want clones. We don't want you to be Saddleback. Did you hear me? We don't want you to be Saddleback. Let me give you a model of this. If you were to go into like a Staples store and you were to see all of the different computers, and they're all lined up on one row, and one computer says IBM, and the other one says AST, and the other says Acer, and the other says